Karen tries to steal another woman's shopping cart, claims she deserves it more. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Saturday mornings at the grocery store were always chaotic, but today felt particularly unhinged. From the moment Melanie pulled into the parking lot, she regretted not squeezing in the shopping trip during the week. Cars crawled through the aisles like ants, each one scanning desperately for any sign of movement from someone unloading bags. Horns honked at indecisive drivers. A rogue cart rolled across a lane, forcing a man to leap sideways. Children cried somewhere in the background, and parents barked instructions at each other over the sound of thudding trunk doors. It was the kind of environment that made people wish they could live off canned beans and frozen peas forever just to avoid this kind of circus. Melanie finally found a narrow spot between a pickup truck and an SUV, parked, grabbed her list, and made her way into the store, already feeling the familiar edge of tension creeping into her shoulders. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead while the air hummed with overlapping voices, rattling carts, and intermittent beeping from checkout lanes. She grabbed a cart, which wobbled slightly to the right, and pushed it into the mass of humanity, determined to get through her list quickly and escape before noon. She started, as always, with the produce. Bananas, spinach, onions, and carrots filled the bottom of the cart while she waited for a woman ahead to finish comparing bags of grapes. Melanie maneuvered around the sluggish crowds, avoiding a near collision with a dad who was looking at his phone while pushing a cart one-handed. By the time she made it past the dairy aisle and toward canned goods, her cart was already half full. Everything was neatly stacked: cans of soup, her usual brand of almond milk, pasta, and a new brand of frozen vegan dinners she'd been meaning to try. She took her time when necessary, double-checking prices and comparing nutrition labels, occasionally stepping away from the cart for just a few seconds when something on a shelf caught her attention. It was in the cereal aisle that things began to unravel. The row was partially blocked by a group of chatty moms with carts angled awkwardly across from each other, turning the aisle into a narrow corridor. Melanie didn't mind too much. She was used to navigating tight spaces and was in no particular hurry. She parked her cart just to the right of the granola section and walked a few feet ahead to compare two brands of muesli. As she read the back of one of the boxes, she saw a flash of movement out of the corner of her eye and turned to look. A woman had just grabbed her cart. Melanie blinked in confusion, watching as the woman, mid to late 40s, dressed in black leggings and a glittery hoodie that read Mom Life, sunglasses still on despite the indoor setting, placed her hand firmly on the handle of Melanie's cart and began pushing it away without a second glance. Her blonde hair was cut into a sharp, bobbed style that looked like it had been precision-cut weekly, and she exuded the kind of impatient, self-important energy that made people instinctively get out of her way. Melanie stepped forward. "Excuse me, that's my cart." The woman turned around slowly, with the exaggerated sigh of someone being asked to do something extremely inconvenient, like cancel brunch plans or move a mountain. "Oh, this?" she asked, tilting her head with faux innocence. "I thought it was just sitting here. I'm in a rush." Melanie stared at her for a beat, waiting for her to realize the absurdity of what she'd just done. "Yes. It was sitting here because I'm shopping. That's my cart. I've been here for nearly an hour." "Well, I don't have that kind of time," the woman said briskly. "You can get your stuff again. I have to be out of here in 15 minutes. I have kids waiting at home." Melanie felt something shift internally, the initial disbelief giving way to an almost surreal amusement at the entitlement being displayed in front of her. "You can't just take someone else's cart," she said, walking toward her. "That's not how this works." The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly growing impatient. "It's groceries. You're not losing anything important. Just get another cart and start again. What's the big deal?" "It's not about the groceries," Melanie replied, keeping her voice calm though she could feel her pulse rising. "It's about the fact that you're trying to take something that doesn't belong to you. You wouldn't walk up to someone's table at a restaurant and start eating their food just because you're in a hurry." "I'm not arguing with you," the woman said, grabbing the handle more firmly. "I have a sick child at home. I don't have time for drama." Melanie narrowed her eyes. The tone had shifted again. Now, the woman was trying to spin a narrative that painted her as the victim of an unreasonable confrontation, rather than the aggressor. "If your child is sick, you probably shouldn't be here shopping," Melanie said pointedly. "And if you're truly in a rush, there are ways to get help without stealing someone else's time and effort." By now, a few other shoppers had begun to glance their way. A man with a toddler in his cart lingered near the end of the aisle, watching without hiding his curiosity. A young woman with earbuds and slowed down just enough to eavesdrop while pretending to browse cereal bars. The woman tried to pull the cart again, and Melanie instinctively grabbed the side to stop her. The cart jerked awkwardly between them, knocking over a box of granola bars that clattered to the floor. "Let go," the woman snapped, her voice rising sharply. "I need this." "You're being ridiculous." "No," Melanie said firmly, holding her ground. "You're being entitled." And there, locked in a silent battle of wills over a grocery cart, they stood. Onlookers stared. The tension was thick enough to taste. The woman's sunglasses finally slid down her nose as she huffed in frustration, and her teenage son, who had been trailing behind her silently, looked away and muttered something under his breath, clearly wishing to disappear. Melanie didn't flinch. She wasn't about to surrender a week's worth of carefully planned meals because a stranger decided her time mattered more. Not today. Not ever. The aisle had fallen quiet. There was an unmistakable shift in energy as more people slowed down to observe what was happening, their curiosity piqued by the escalating tension. Melanie stood firm on one side of the cart, fingers wrapped around the bar as though it were a lifeline, while the woman, the one now mentally labeled Karen by several silent witnesses, dug in on the opposite side, lips pressed tight and jaw clenched with the stubbornness of someone who refused to back down, not because she was right, but because backing down would imply that someone else had authority over her. The cart trembled slightly between them, half filled with groceries that had taken Melanie nearly an hour to gather with care and intention, and now at risk of being hijacked under the absurd claim of entitlement disguised as urgency. Karen huffed again, dramatically glancing at her phone as if to broadcast to everyone nearby how deeply inconvenienced she was by this entire situation. "Unbelievable," she muttered loudly enough for half the aisle to hear. "I'm just trying to take care of my family, and this woman is making a federal case over a bunch of groceries." Her voice had that performative edge, the kind meant to invite sympathy from strangers, to paint herself as the exasperated victim rather than the instigator. Melanie didn't waver, though her grip had tightened. Her voice remained calm, measured, but her patience was stretched taut. "I'm not stopping you from shopping," she said steadily. "You're welcome to use a cart. There are more at the entrance. But this one is mine. I've already done the work. You're trying to take it because it's convenient for you, and you think you can just bulldoze people to get your way." Karen's teenager stood nearby, arms crossed and eyes glued to the floor. He looked like he wanted to vanish into a stack of cereal boxes. "Can we just go?" he mumbled under his breath, but Karen didn't acknowledge him. Her gaze was locked on Melanie, eyes flashing with frustration and something else, maybe disbelief that someone was actually standing up to her. Whatever fantasy world she usually operated in, Melanie clearly wasn't playing by its rules. A short, balding man in a red store vest appeared at the end of the aisle, radio clipped to his belt and expression hesitant. His name tag read Nick, shift manager. He approached with the wary steps of someone who had been called to deal with problems more absurd than he had ever imagined when he took this job. "Hi, is there an issue here?" he asked, looking from one woman to the other like he was trying to identify which one was going to explode first. Karen immediately switched gears. She dropped the cart handle and pivoted toward him with the sudden, almost impressive poise of a seasoned actor. "Yes, thank God you're here," she said, stepping closer. "This woman's been following me through the store and now she's trying to take my cart. I've got a sick child at home and I don't have time for this kind of harassment." Melanie blinked. "Excuse me," she said, incredulous, but Karen was already spinning her tail like a spider weaving silk, talking quickly and animatedly, making grand gestures with her hands. "I was just trying to get out of here quickly," she said, her voice now high-pitched and dripping with faux emotion. I saw an unattended cart and assumed it was available. Then she shows up screaming at me, accusing me of theft, and grabbing the cart like a maniac. Nick's eyes darted to Melanie. His expression was cautious but curious, as if he had heard this exact kind of story before and was waiting to see how it unraveled. Melanie took a slow breath and straightened her back. I stepped away from my cart for maybe 20 seconds, she said, keeping her voice calm and even. It was parked in the aisle like everyone else's, and I was 3 feet away comparing cereals. She walked over, grabbed it without asking, and tried to take it. When I confronted her, she told me I could just shop all over again because she was in a rush. That's when she got aggressive. Nick looked between the two women for a long moment. Karen's arms were crossed now, her mouth set in a tight, defiant line. Melanie stood with one hand on her cart, the other loosely at her side. Several other shoppers lingered nearby, pretending to be interested in granola bars while clearly eavesdropping. A middle-aged woman in yoga pants who had been browsing nearby stepped forward cautiously. Sorry, but I saw what happened, she said quietly to Nick. That woman, she gestured at Karen, just walked up and took the cart. The other one was right there. It definitely wasn't abandoned. Nick gave her a grateful nod. Karen whirled around, eyes narrowed. Unbelievable. People are so quick to take sides without knowing the full story. You mean without knowing the story you just made up? Melanie said dryly, her patience finally cracking around the edges. Karen looked like she was about to erupt, but Nick held up a hand. Okay, let's all take a breath, he said. This isn't something we need to argue about in the middle of the store. We can go check the security cameras if there's any confusion. Melanie welcomed the suggestion with a nod, but Karen stiffened. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crept across her face. She hesitated, lips parting slightly, as if calculating whether her fabricated narrative would survive being tested against recorded footage. Her son shifted uncomfortably again, clearly sensing the tide turning. Are you serious? Karen asked Nick. You're going to waste everyone's time over this? Nick's expression didn't change. If there's a dispute about store property or harassment, we're obligated to review it, he said. You're welcome to come with me. Otherwise, I'll have to ask that the cart remain with the person who originally filled it. Karen looked at Melanie, then at the cart, then back at the crowd of silent spectators who were now pretending a little less successfully to be occupied with their shopping. Her jaw twitched. Whatever, she snapped finally, throwing up her hands. It's not worth it. This store has terrible customer service anyway. I'm not coming back. With that, she turned sharply on her heel and stormed away, her son trailing behind her without a word, eyes downcast. Melanie stood still for a moment, exhaling slowly as the adrenaline began to ebb. Nick gave her an apologetic look. Sorry about that, he said. Let me know if she comes back or causes any more problems. She won't, Melanie replied, glancing at the cart. Not if it means being held accountable. She began picking up the items that had fallen during the brief tug-of-war, placing them back in the cart carefully, her movements methodical. Around her, the onlookers quietly dispersed, the spectacle over, the show concluded. But the quiet murmur of approval followed her as she wheeled her cart toward the next aisle, resolved not to let entitlement win the day. As Melanie moved past the cereal aisle, her fingers still loosely wrapped around the cart's handle, she felt the aftershocks of the confrontation ripple through her. Her heartbeat, which had thudded so loudly in her ears just minutes ago, was beginning to settle into a slower, steadier rhythm, but the ghost of adrenaline lingered in her limbs. She wasn't the type to seek conflict. In fact, she usually went out of her way to avoid it, but something about the blatant entitlement she'd just faced had sparked a flame she hadn't realized was there. It wasn't just about the cart. It was about principle, about decency, about the line in the sand that too many people seemed willing to cross simply because they thought no one would call them out. And now, after having stood her ground, Melanie felt something unexpected, not just relief, but clarity, like her spine had straightened a bit taller, like her voice had carried a little stronger. Despite the mess, the sideways glances, and the murmurs from nearby shoppers, she resumed her shopping with a renewed sense of purpose. She steered the cart down the frozen foods aisle, reviewing the remainder of her list while taking in the familiar hum of the cold units and the faint scent of disinfectant. The store had returned to its usual rhythm, though she noticed more than a few people shooting her subtle looks, some curious, others quietly approving. One older man gave her a slight nod as he passed with a bag of frozen peas in one hand, as if silently acknowledging the small act of rebellion she had just pulled off in the face of casual tyranny. It would have been easy to shake off the incident and pretend it didn't matter. But as Melanie reached into the freezer for a bag of stir-fry vegetables, she thought about all the times she'd simply let things go, told herself it wasn't worth the trouble, that making a scene wasn't polite. She'd seen people like that woman before, Karen, as she now dubbed her in her head with more irony than malice, wielding entitlement like a weapon, using fake urgency and fabricated victimhood to bulldoze others. It wasn't new, but it was exhausting, and this time she'd chosen not to be flattened under it. That choice, small as it seemed, had left its mark. She rounded the next corner and spotted a young mother struggling to juggle a toddler on her hip while scanning shelves for baby food. Melanie offered a kind smile as she passed, and when the toddler dropped a pacifier onto the tile floor, Melanie picked it up without hesitation, handing it back with a gentle, "Here you go," before moving on. The mother thanked her with a tired smile. Simple human moments, honest, reciprocal, untainted by entitlement or pretense, restored Melanie's belief that most people, despite their flaws, were just trying to get through their day with a shred of grace. Halfway through the refrigerated section, her cart nearly full now, Melanie paused to check her list again when she heard a familiar voice, a nasal tone that immediately set her teeth on edge. She turned slightly and, to her dismay, saw Karen again, 2 aisles over, speaking animatedly to a different store employee. Her sunglasses were perched atop her head now, and she was gesturing wildly with one hand while holding her phone in the other, waving it like some kind of badge of grievance. Melanie couldn't make out every word, but certain phrases floated toward her with toxic clarity: humiliated, completely unprofessional, legal action, and, most absurdly, physical intimidation. The employee nodded along with polite disinterest, clearly doing his best to listen without getting involved in something he likely knew was exaggerated beyond recognition. Melanie didn't move. She simply watched, observing the meltdown from a safe distance, noting how Karen's teenage son stood again with slumped shoulders a few feet away, pretending to browse energy drinks while doing everything he could to avoid being associated with his mother. It was a sad image, more pathetic than threatening, and Melanie felt a strange mix of vindication and pity. It was clear now that Karen wasn't going to let the incident go. People like her rarely did. They couldn't afford to, because admitting fault, admitting they might not be the hero in their own narrative, was simply not an option. Still, Melanie wasn't worried. She had the truth on her side. She had a witness who had spoken up. She had a shift manager who had calmly diffused the situation. And, most importantly, she had stood her ground without stooping to Karen's level. She turned back to her list and kept moving. By the time she reached the checkout area, the store had begun to thin out. The early morning rush was giving way to a quieter, more manageable flow of customers. She chose the self-checkout lane, not because she didn't want to talk to anyone, but because she needed to be alone for a few minutes to process the whirlwind of emotions that had built up during the past hour. As she scanned each item, the familiar beeping provided a soothing rhythm, a sense of progress. Bananas, almond milk, frozen stir-fry, a box of cereal. Normalcy returning, one barcode at a time. As she bagged her groceries, she noticed a small note taped near the machine: "Be kind. We're all doing our best." It was handwritten, probably by one of the younger cashiers, and it struck her with unexpected force. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at it, letting the message sink in. That was it, really, the essence of what today had been about. Kindness. Boundaries. Standing up when someone else decided they didn't have to play by the same rules. Doing your best, even when someone else was doing their worst. Melanie finished her transaction, loaded the bags into her cart, and made her way toward the exit. The automatic doors whooshed open and she stepped into the bright daylight, her breath catching slightly at the contrast between the sterile lighting of the store and the warm sun overhead. The parking lot was calmer now, though she spotted Karen's SUV still parked not far from her own car, the woman now sitting in the driver's seat, talking furiously into her phone. Melanie didn't look over again. She didn't need to. The situation had already played out, and the outcome didn't need further acknowledgement. She reached her car, popped the trunk, and began loading bags one by one, methodically and efficiently. As she placed the final bag inside and closed the trunk, a faint breeze lifted her hair, and she stood there for a moment, letting it brush against her skin. Her eyes closed briefly. The whole encounter had taken maybe 30 minutes out of her day, but it had stirred something that would last far longer, a resolve to never again second-guess her right to push back against the small tyrannies people try to impose under the guise of urgency or self-importance. Melanie slid into the driver's seat, started the car, and pulled out of the lot with a quiet sense of victory, not the kind that came with applause or recognition, but the quiet, powerful kind that comes when you know, without a shadow of a doubt, that you did the right thing simply because it was right. The week passed, but the incident at the grocery store clung to Melanie in a way she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't that she replayed every word or gesture obsessively, but the moment had crystallized into something larger than a random Saturday inconvenience. It had become a symbol of the many times she, and people like her, had swallowed frustration for the sake of keeping peace. It echoed in the way she hesitated slightly before asserting herself at work, in the quiet internal voice that told her to stay small when she wanted to speak. But now that voice had been challenged, and with each passing day, its volume faded a little more. She hadn't told many people about what happened. Not because she was embarrassed, far from it, but because she knew how such stories tended to be dismissed or twisted when told secondhand. Everyone had dealt with a Karen at some point. People either laughed or rolled their eyes or offered empty sympathy. But what she had experienced wasn't funny, and it wasn't just annoying. It was a direct encounter with a worldview built entirely on selfishness and the expectation that others would cave to it. Melanie had drawn a line, and as a result, something inside her had realigned. On Friday afternoon, she returned to the same grocery store. She hadn't intended to, it was simply the most convenient on her route home from work, but as she pulled into the lot and recognized the familiar layout, she realized she was curious, maybe even eager, to see it again. Not the woman, but the space. The scene of the crime, so to speak. She didn't feel apprehensive. In fact, she felt grounded, steady in a way she hadn't before. Her spine had memory now. Her hands knew what it felt like to hold their ground. She grabbed a cart and moved through the automatic doors, surprised at how quickly the store's familiarity settled her nerves. The same overhead lights. The same polished tile floors. A few of the same employees, including Nick, the shift manager, who was stocking a shelf near the front with boxes of organic pasta. When he looked up and saw her, recognition flickered across his face. He smiled, subdued but genuine, and gave her a small nod. "Hey," he said, standing upright. "Haven't seen you since last weekend. Hope things have been quieter for you." Melanie smiled back, her hand on the cart handle. "They have. Thanks again for helping with that mess. I wasn't expecting it to turn into a showdown in the middle of the breakfast aisle." Nick laughed under his breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "You handled it better than most people would have. You'd be surprised how often folks just let stuff like that happen to them. You didn't." "I think I surprised myself," Melanie admitted, her tone light but honest. She just assumed she could take what she wanted. That no one would stop her. "She's been banned from the store," Nick added casually, but not without a certain satisfaction. "We reviewed the footage. Apparently she's caused problems here before, but never that blatant. Corporate decided she's no longer welcome. Her kid actually came back later in the week and apologized to the front desk. Said he was sorry for his mom's behavior. He looked like he meant it." Melanie felt a strange knot unwind in her chest. She hadn't expected consequences to come from the encounter, hadn't needed them to feel justified, but hearing that something had changed in the aftermath gave the entire experience more weight. It hadn't just been a flash of chaos. It had left a footprint. "I'm glad," she said softly. "Maybe that kid will get a chance to grow up differently." Nick nodded. Sometimes people just need to see someone push back. Gives them permission to do the same. Melanie thanked him again and continued on her way, cartwheels clicking softly against the tile. She moved through the aisles with an ease she hadn't noticed before, not just because the store felt more familiar, but because she felt more rooted in herself. She made deliberate choices, reached for what she needed without second-guessing whether she was in anyone's way or taking too long. She took up space, and for the first time in a while, she didn't feel the urge to apologize for it. While browsing the produce section, she overheard a young couple quietly debating over apples versus oranges. Their conversation, playfully intense, reminded her of her own college days, when such small decisions had felt like vital acts of independence. Further down, a little girl sat in the basket of a cart while her father picked out peppers, her tiny hand stretching toward the mist that puffed gently over the greens. The normalcy of it all struck Melanie with a wave of warmth. The store was just a store again. No battles. No showdowns. Just people doing their best, surrounded by choices and needs and tiny acts of humanity. As she approached the checkout lanes, she saw a woman ahead of her struggling to lift a heavy case of water bottles into her cart. Without hesitation, Melanie stepped forward and offered a hand, lifting the case with a practiced grip and settling it neatly beside the woman's other groceries. The woman smiled gratefully and thanked her. "No problem at all," Melanie replied, meaning it. She paid for her groceries, bagged them quickly, and walked back into the late afternoon sun. The sky was soft blue, with streaks of gold where the light dipped between clouds. She paused beside her car, keys in hand, and looked back at the store for a moment. It was just a building. Just a place to buy food. But she knew now that everyday places were where the most important parts of ourselves often showed up, whether we were standing in line, holding a door open, or choosing whether or not to speak when something felt wrong. As she packed the groceries into her trunk, Melanie felt the subtle but unmistakable presence of closure. Not the dramatic, sweeping kind found in novels, but the kind that settles quietly in your bones and tells you that you did what needed to be done. She hadn't just stood up to a difficult person, she had stood up for herself, for decency, for the silent rule that we all owe one another some basic respect. That mattered. And now, it was done. She slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled out of the lot, the radio low and the windows cracked just enough to let in the breeze. The road ahead was clear, familiar, and hers to follow. And though no one would mark the day or write it into history, she knew that in a small corner of the world, on a regular Saturday morning, something important had been defended. And that was more than enough.